Massive, massive news out of Europe this weekend. Dusted under the rug, but this is huge news, folks. It is the largest response by NATO to the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. If you thought the sanctions were something, if you thought the cutting out of Russia of SWIFT was something, that actually could pale in comparison to what just occurred this weekend, but nobody's talking about it. If you know your map in Europe, you know that Russia is all one big chunk, except for one little pop over in the Baltic coast. There is the enclave of Kaliningrad, and that is a massive military base outpost. It's a city-state, essentially, but it has been heavily militarized. This is considered to be extremely strategically important to Russia. It is more important to Russia than Crimea is. And if you're following the news of what's been going on in the last couple of years, you know how important Crimea is. We are going to need to be looking at the status of forces in the Baltic area, so we will walk through some of that, but we're going to need to walk through some of the treaties that have just been violated. Basically, NATO has taken several treaties in Europe and torn them up. Lithuania has arguably violated the peace treaty between Russia and Lithuania that caused Lithuania to be recognized for independence. We're going to walk through some of that in this short time frame. So what has happened? Lithuania, under orders from the EU, has blocked rail imports across Belarus through Lithuania to Kaliningrad. This is not a complete ban. However, they are sanctioning a list of items including coal, metal, construction materials, and advanced technologies. They say that the ban will cover about 50% of the rail imports into Kaliningrad. This is huge, folks. And we're going to walk through what Russia has said about this, what they will do if this were to happen, and their perspective on things. And mark my words, they are fully capable of carrying out the threats that they have issued. The United States and NATO understands that those threats are very real and have taken steps, and this explains some of the military buildup in Poland. U.S. forces in Poland and other NATO forces in Estonia, as well as Lithuania, are now in harm's way because they are literally standing in the way of what Russia has said that they would do if this were to happen. So news of the ban came through late Friday through a video by the region's governor, Anton Alikhanov. So the EU sanctions will go into effect immediately on all rail transport coming through Lithuania. Now, like I said, there's this gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which is a de facto puppet state of Russia. So all the forces can go through Russia, all their materials can go through Belarus, but it cannot actually cross into Kaliningrad. They don't have a rail. They don't have a rail line. They don't have a road that goes directly there. They can either bring things in by ship or they have to go through Lithuania. It is called the Suwalki Corridor, and this has been a discussion ever since the fall of the Soviet Union about this corridor being invaded. Russia has wargamed this out ridiculously. They have had exercises even within the last year preparing to seize this part of Lithuania. And while this is extremely critical to Russia to have this corridor so that they can move their supplies and troops and everything like that into Kaliningrad, it is also important to note that if they cut this corridor, this cuts Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia off from a land route from Poland and the rest of Europe. The only way to get into Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia would then be by ship or going through Russian territory. In Moscow's eyes, this is tantamount to laying economic siege on a part of Russia's sovereign territory and its 1 million citizens. When the EU first proposed the blockade of goods as part of the last major sanctions package back in April, the Kremlin officials warned of war given Moscow would have to break the blockade for the sake of its citizens. Folks, that's what has been promised and threatened by Russia. Let's get into the actual statement here. Statements from this is actually from an April 6th statement by a State Duma official, an official of Russia, in his capacity speaking on behalf of Russia. It says, statements from the West about a possible blockade of Kaliningrad is testing the waters, but Russia can break the blockade in case these threats become a reality. What is he saying? He's saying invasion of Lithuania, which is a NATO member, which would arguably trigger the NATO response in defense of Lithuania. I think that for now, this is a game testing the waters. In case of a blockade, as they are saying, the Soviet Union knows how to break blockades. We, Russia, as a successor of the Soviet Union, have vast experience. If they want to go to the length of making us break the blockade to save the lives of our people who live there, we can do this. He expressed hope, however, the West will have enough brains to opt against this. Do you hear the language there? Russia does not consider this an invasion. It considers this a defensive measure. Okay? As if they're being invaded. And Russia has said repeatedly that they will defend their territory and if they feel that they are being threatened by foreign powers. And in this case, they are seeing basically Lithuania putting troops, cutting two parts of their border, two parts of their territory apart from each other. The United States, and listen, the United States would absolutely not tolerate this. If Canada were to put troops between, there's some little outlier islands and stuff like that on the U.S. border. If Canada were to put troops there and isolate and refuse to allow rail and road access by American citizens and American trucking and stuff like that into some of these areas, that would be considered an act of war by the United States. So let's not all jump on the anti-Russia thing. This is, now they may have it coming. And believe me, what they've done in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, those are acts of war, and this is ain't nobody clean in this. But those have been very provocative, very horrible actions. Lots of people have lost their lives because of these actions, whether they were provoked by NATO, by threatening to put nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I mean, this is, we can just keep going back all the way, through several thousand years of history and say, whose fault is it? But really, when it comes down to it, what we're seeing is that NATO and Russia are squaring off for a fight. And NATO has just escalated things significantly. This is a 100-kilometer ribbon of territory across Lithuania that Russia has wargamed and practiced taking not a long time ago. Last year's Zapad military exercise, they practiced closing the Suwalki Corridor by attacking from Belarus in the direction of Kaliningrad. Where are Russian troops right now? You better believe they have 200,000 troops deployed in Kaliningrad right now. Do the math on that. 1 million people, Russians, in Kaliningrad, and 200,000 of them are soldiers. Okay? Does that sound like a military outpost to you? Because that's what it is. It is like a giant fortification sitting right on the Baltic coast between some of the NATO members. This is a massive threat to NATO security in that area and has always been. Russia has not wanted anything NATO has not wanted anything less than taking Kaliningrad or taking it out of action for a very long period of time. This is a major NATO priority. However, Russia has known that this is a massive priority to NATO and has, for the last 30 years, fortified Kaliningrad, and it was being fortified back in the Soviet Union even before then. The Russian enclave in Kaliningrad, which lies between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea and is geographically separate from the rest of Russia, practically bristles with S-300 and S-400 air defense missile systems. These are the S-400s are the most advanced anti-ballistic missile capabilities. These are truck-mounted surface-to-air missile systems. The S-300 is primarily designed to take out stealth aircraft and other aircraft, and the S-400 system can take out aircraft, but it is designed to take out incoming missiles. They have moved heavy air defense systems into Kaliningrad, and they've been heavily fortified in that place. Basically, they can shut down all air traffic over Poland, across all of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. They can even shut down most of the Baltic Sea from air traffic by shooting down anything that flies. In addition to that, they have Onyx anti-ship missiles, which can shut down the Baltic Sea from any ships that Russia doesn't want to be floating out there. And the Iskander surface-to-surface missiles, they can attack and they can threaten Poland as well as possibly even into Russia, Germany, and also into like Finland and like Sweden and such. These missile systems are powerful. Also, Kaliningrad being so important, there are also short-range ballistic missiles deployed in Kaliningrad since at least 2012. We're going to get back to that in just a second because we're not just talking about ballistic missiles, conventional. I'm tipping my hand on that one. But they also have two massive air bases there, Chernobyl, something with lots of consonants, and Donetsky. And they also host the Russian Baltic Fleet from the naval base there. There have been unsubstantiated reports that Russia may have moved nuclear weapons into Kaliningrad after the United States announced plans to build a missile defense shield in Poland. WikiLeaks in 2009 released a 2002 Congressional Research Service report detailing that the United States intelligence had detected the presence of nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad through satellite technology. 2002, they detected nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad. And as they say in Russia, once you put your nukes in Kaliningrad, you don't take your nukes from Kaliningrad. They don't say that, but it sounds like something a Russian would say. So, this is big. Let's get into... So, they're talking about potentially invading Lithuania over this ban. We need to look at the legal framework here, okay? The legal framework is that this is... NATO troops. First, let's look at NATO troops. Sorry. So NATO has been kind of limited by treaties of how many troops that they can have in Lithuania and Estonia and such. So basically, they've only had about 1,000 troops, NATO troops in Lithuania, and about 1,000 troops in Estonia. They haven't upped those forces out of fear of violating some of these treaties, some of these agreements that have been made. But as you'll be able to see, they are basically taking several of these treaties and ripping them up right now. So they are talking about upping the the battalions in Lithuania and Estonia from about 1,000 troops to starting to deploy actual full brigades. So that would take it up to about 4,000 or 5,000 troops in each country. Germany is talking about deploying their troops to Lithuania, and the United Kingdom is talking about deploying a full brigade to Estonia. Whew, lots more to cover. So that's where it has been. Let's look at this, what has been broken, what agreements are breaking. So in 1997, NATO made an agreement with Russia. And this is basically when they started bringing in the Baltic states. They pledged not to deploy significant forces in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. The Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mircea Gheana, just declared that the NATO-Russian agreement signed 25 years ago no longer binds the alliance because Russia itself violated the agreement by invading Ukraine. So the 1997 NATO-Russia Framework Agreement has been declared by the Deputy Secretary General of the NATO to be invalid. They've torn it up. So let's go through really quickly what these sections of this treaty actually say. First off, basically saying that NATO and Russia will recognize the territorial integrity of states and settle their disputes peaceably. That is what NATO is arguing Russia has violated, so therefore the treaty is off. It also creates a new forum and a NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council for meetings and to work out conflicts. Section 3 describes a range of issues between NATO and Russia about conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and cooperation and such. And Section 4 describes that the military dimensions of the relationship, basically talking about status of forces and not deploying troops along the border of Russia. However, this also points back to a earlier treaty, the Conventional Armed Forces Treaty in Europe, CFE. This has already been formally been withdrawn by Russia because in 2007, because they said NATO has been in violation of this. This basically states where different countries and such can have their forces in Europe. They're only allowed to have so many tanks, so many gunships, so many this and that in different zones inside Europe. And basically, when NATO said, hey, we're going to take Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia on to full member status of NATO, those were actually like non-member states. So basically, theoretically, NATO could just like pump tons of troops and weapons and everything like that right into the on the Russian border, and Russia's like, no, that's not cool, and so that's why the 1997 agreement is so critical here, because that was what made the Convention of Armed Forces in Europe, the conventional treaty, to be kind of like workable, is because NATO agreed not to put troops there. But now that that's scrapped, basically everyone has just withdrawn from the Convention of Forces treaty in Europe. Nobody is abiding by this anymore. But we need to go back even further, like I said, that this is basically violating the 1991 July 29th treaty between Lithuania and the Russian Federation. This is on file with the UN and is basically the basis between peace between Lithuania and the Russian Republic. Article 11. The Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, there's too many words in there, but it is, expresses a special interest. Okay, so Russia is interested in this point, but it says, while the Republic of Lithuania assumes what? The obligation to contribute to the preservation of favorable conditions for the economic and national cultural development of the Kaliningrad Oblast. Assumes the obligation for favorable conditions for the economic. Does this take away from the favorable conditions? Lithuania is part of the EU and NATO, which has sanctions on Russia, including the Kaliningrad Oblast. One could very readily argue that they are now in violation and they have basically scrapped the peace treaty between Lithuania and Russia. So Russia considers this to be a defensive action to invade Lithuania. Even the treaties between NATO and Russia have all been now scrapped, which is there a peace treaty between is NATO and Russia at war right now? That's a question. NATO has now taken multiple steps that are considered by the United Nations as acts of war against Russia. All of the agreements that exist to recognize peace between NATO and Russia have been scrapped, essentially. Are we already de facto at a state of war between NATO and Russia? And I think that the case could be made that that is exactly where we are. Can Russia take the Suwalki Corridor? Listen to this. One of the guests on 60 Minutes, Russia's top-rated politics talk show, last week presented a detailed plan. This is actually going back a little bit, though. A detailed plan demonstrating how Russian forces could attack NATO Baltic states and go on to attack neutral Sweden. Colonel Igor Korotchenko, formerly of the Russian General Staff and Air Force, and currently a reserve officer, pointed at a map showing Russian forces pushing up from Kaliningrad and blocking NATO reinforcements by closing the Suwalki Corridor. A massive Russian radio electronic strike is inflicted. Read that as an EMP attack or directed radio electronic strikes against civilian targets as well as military targets, potentially. All NATO radars would go blind and see nothing. This is not some kind of weird fringe theory. NATO is literally putting troops on the ground to defend the Suwalki Strait. And Russia has been pre-positioning troops against the to take the Suwalki Strait. They have actually moved more troops into Belarus for this express purpose. A lot of people have said, why isn't Russia using its most advanced tanks in the Ukraine? And this is one of the answers, because those tanks are actually staged to take the Suwalki Strait corridor. Folks, we could be looking at stage one, an invasion of the Suwalki Corridor, and potentially a second stage of an invasion into the Baltic states. Have those troops been, are there enough troops to take those Baltic states at this point? I have not heard intelligence that there is, but that might be the ultimate goal on that. And why do I say that? Because inside NATO, they've been having this conversation of, we want to deploy more troops to Estonia and Lithuania. We want to go up to brigade size. And Germany is like, let's do it. But there's pushback within the NATO alliance saying we shouldn't put our troops so close to Russia because Russia will kill them all. NATO is saying there's a likelihood that Russia will invade and kill our troops if we put them in there. That's NATO saying it's possible and potentially likely. And two, Russia can actually do it. If we're afraid to put troops in there, that tells you something. We are on the brink of World War III. This is a massive, massive step and escalation in the conflict. Again, I am not saying who's right, who's wrong. I'm saying this conflict has gone to another level. And both sides see themselves in the right, and one side has already communicated what their action would be if this step were taken. We're going to have to see in the next weeks what moves forward, but we may very well see a land invasion of a NATO country in the next short bit. Folks, if you didn't see the most recent food shortage updates, you might want to check those out here. Otherwise, I will see you later. Steve Poplar out.